Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are audible and visible. Parth, can you mute yourself? I think you unmuted. Yep. PM whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Nasa. My preferred gender pronouns are she, they. If you have any POIs, please put them in the chat. I'll probably take one from closing. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things from me. Firstly, an important setup for this debate. Secondly, why people do not consent into the law. And thirdly, why this active lack of consent means that these people do not have a moral obligation to follow the law, right? Firstly, on setup, mainly 3 important things in this debate. Firstly, this motion isn't about whether the obligations that are obligated by law in and of itself is something that is morally obligatory to these people. We're not talking about whether killing a person is morally good or not, but whether we should follow the law in and of itself, and whether the law in and of itself mandates people to do specific things, right? Therefore, Ob cannot just argue why the actions that are determined by the law are good or bad, but whether why this law specifically makes these actions obligatory or creates this moral obligations for these people. Therefore, they cannot just base their case on examples of the law in which this is better to be followed, but rather why this law inherently makes this individual obligated to follow this action in and of itself, right? But secondly, they cannot just say that some laws are good or some people should follow laws, but they have to inherently prove why everyone has to follow all of the laws that exist in the state, right? This is because the law stuff is likely to be determined through procedures that make the law, and therefore this procedure now has to be the reason why you follow this law. They cannot just say that some laws are arbitrarily good or some laws are arbitrarily bad. They have to prove why law in and of itself being a law more obligates individuals to follow it, right? But thirdly, they cannot just prove that it's better to follow law. They cannot just say that it's better utilitarianly if people follow law. This doesn't mean that these people have an moral obligation to follow the law, right? For example, maybe if I donate all my organs to 10 people and 10 people live, it's probably better for the world, even if I die. That doesn't mean that I have the obligation to donate all my organs. The same analogy applies here. They cannot just say that more people are saved. They have to prove why this now mandates these individuals to have this obligation, which is something that is a burden of opposition. With this setup done, I'm going to prove to you 2 things. Firstly, on why people never inherently consent into the law or inherently consent into the decision-making process of the law in the first place, right? The first main reason here is that people are born arbitrarily into law and they're unable to escape the law and the captures of the law that they have. The first reason is because you not consent into being born in the first place, meaning at the point in which you are born, you are obligated to follow law. However, you never consented into being born in the first place, and therefore the restrictions that law puts on you is something that you never actually consented into because you never consented to being born in the first place, right? But secondly, you're unable to escape this law, and meaning that in the absence of an alternative, the consent that you have is minimal at best because you're unable to have an alternative way or an escape from this, meaning that this is coercion at its max, right? This for 2 reasons. Firstly, because first of all, it's very difficult to move countries, for example, in which you're unable to escape the captures of law because things like your nationality would bind you down to the law and to the country itself. But secondly, even if you were able to move to different countries, everywhere in the world is obligated, has law to some extent, meaning that you're unable to ever escape the entrapments of what law obligates you to do. And therefore, this means that no one in this world never consented into being born or cannot escape this, meaning that this is a form of coercion that happens on their house. The second thing is that people are locked out of decision making and actually cannot affect the ways in which law are created or what kind of law is likely to be imposed on them, right? The first main reason is because law is something that's passed down through generations, and many times the structures of law that obligate you and restrict you now are something that you never had any say in, meaning that the generations before you decided this law and you never actively had the consent or had the power to change this in any way. But secondly, it's absolutely difficult to change now, right? From a few reasons. The first reason is because even in the best case of a functional democracy, which is already being very charitable, in which many countries aren't even democratic, even if it is a good democracy, it's a majority vote, meaning that at best, 70% of people have consented into what this law means, but the remainder 30% of people never had the say, or the opinions of these 30% of people were ignored, meaning that they never had a say in what this law obligates for them. But secondly, people are many times locked out of the process of being able to decide a law in itself, right? Because firstly, the voting process requires things like education for you to understand what the law means to you, for you to have a meaningful vote in election to change the law. But secondly, if you want to directly change the law, you have to become a lawyer, for example, a lawmaker, which is likely to require you to have things like background information and education that is many times inaccessible to the majority of people on the ground. The third main reason is because you are obligated to change the minds of everyone else around you to be able to change change law, which is something that is firstly out of your control at the point in which you have to change the subjective minds of everyone else around you, which is many times impossible for this individual at the point in which other people are uncontrollable to you. But secondly, it's not your call at best because you never had a say in it. Maybe the other people consented into it. You never did, right? Before I move on, sure, I take a PR from closing.
Yeah, so you told us we can't just list examples where the law is good. Your entire case so far is just listing examples where you might not be able to affect the law. That's not inherent and that's not an obligatory principle.
We agree that the law is something that we agree that this might be context dependent. I'm taking the very, very best context that you can have. The only way in which law will be decided is either intergenerationally or you're able to change it. I already disproved both of these things, meaning that even in your best case in which a functional democracy happens, this law in and of itself, because of the process that it goes through, is something that people are unable to consent in. This isn't an example. This is inherent to how the law is created in and of itself, right? So thirdly and importantly, why does this lack of consent mean that people should not be morally obligatory to the law, right? Meaning three things that I want to go through here. The first reason is because people never agree to the consequences and the exchange and the trade-off that this law makes in and of itself, meaning that probably opposition is going to run a case of reciprocal obligation. You never consented into the reciprocal trade-off between your restrictions and the law and the maybe benefits that you get from the state, and therefore you yourself do not have obligations to follow the law in the first place, right? The second main reason here is that this law in and of itself makes you instrumental to the state, right? This is something that is basically analytically close to something like exploitation or slavery, which is in and of itself morally abhorrent, meaning that people are unobligated to follow this in the first place. But thirdly, we'd say that law in and of itself is something that's restriction on basic human rights, right? This for the reason that one, law is in general a restriction to your actions, meaning that the way in which you can function as a human, the things that you can do in your life, the things that you can consume, for example, the ways in which you can live your life, and the ways in which you can walk around on the street and stuff are decided by law, meaning that it's a restriction on the autonomy that you're able to act and the autonomy that you're able to exercise within your life, meaning, but secondly, many times when you go against this law, there's going to be violence put upon you in which you're locked up and confined and stuff, or you're going to be beaten up, meaning that this is in and of itself an abhorrent violation of human dignity in of itself, right? We would say that this human dignity is something that is more important than law, because for the reason that firstly, it's morally more superior at the point in which it's inherent to every individual, and every individual has the capacity to exercise this because on the comparative though, law is something that was arbitrarily decided by people that were before you, and you had no way to change this, right? But secondly, we would say that human dignity we're able to value more consent on our set house because we have because we're able to maximize the individual freedoms of people, and we don't think that law necessarily allows this because it's inherently a restriction on people's autonomy. We have proven to you is that law in and of itself is something that is no one consented into. This uniquely already proves us that people don't have moral obligation. We have already clearly taken this debate.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting leader of opposition.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible, please?
Yes, you're audible and visible.
Thank you. Okay. Panel. Life in a state of nature, as Hobbes said, is nasty, brutish, and short. Therefore, we think that we should, and any rational individual would, consent to come into such a society. In my speech, I'm going to prove to you why I think we do consent fundamentally into being into societies, or we can infer consent in a meaningful way. I'm also going to prove why I think that we can justify this on utilitarian considerations and considerations to your fellow citizens to invoke this moral obligation to a greater extent. Lots of rebuttal will be integrated, but let's deal with a few extraneous points. Firstly, she says that like basically, oh, you can't justify this on utilitarian grounds because of like the example of a doctor and his organs. Note here that I'm not going to do this. Rather, what I will promote is real utilitarianism, i.e. panel, I think that you have a moral obligation to follow rules such that if everyone followed them, it would produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. Note this specifically deals with the concerns that the previous speaker has about like the doctor example, for instance, because in a society in which every doctor went around stealing organs whenever they needed to save lives, it would cause chaos and wouldn't promote utility overall. Therefore, I will be advocating for real utilitarianism, not ACT, in this debate panel. Okay, a second point of extraneous rebuttal. She says you don't consent to laws, right? I will prove this in my speech, but a couple other things on our mechanisms. Firstly, she brings in children and how like you have intergenerational formation of laws. Firstly, note that you do have the ability to change laws made by past generations insofar as you have an ability to vote in democracies where we think this debate is based. Secondly, note that it doesn't apply to children in most countries with democracies in the same extent, i.e. you can't lock up like a 5-year-old who commits a crime specifically because they don't have an understanding of the law, and specifically because they don't have this like full conception of consent, and therefore children are not in this debate. Secondly, she says like this weird thing of like you have to become a lawyer or like you need to be like a really elite in society in order to be able to change laws. Note that this isn't the case. One, lawyers obviously don't change laws, but two, you can change laws through voting for MPs or voting for senators or what have you in order to change laws with your vote, which is granted to every citizen. A bit of framing to set up my speech. So firstly, we think that we are talking about democracies in this debate. I'm defining a democracy here as one in which like all major groups are enfranchised, at least to some extent. I don't think this has to be like a perfect democracy for our case. It can be harder for some groups to vote, but like we're not talking about countries or laws in which like individuals cannot vote. Okay, so we think that we have the fiat to do this in the debate, but I think I have a further justification of this in that we think that a moral obligation to follow the law still exists in these cases, but you have a stronger moral obligation to your fellow citizens to like rebel if women are denied the vote in that country. Okay, with that framing set up, why do we have a principled justification to follow the law? We note, panel, that rational individuals would choose to live in a society if we consider the beginning of its history at a state of nature. Why is this the case? Firstly, it's because they want to protect their property. Secondly, it's because they don't want to live a life that's unstable and unbearable. And thirdly, it's because they don't want violence committed against them. The state of nature, i.e. the state without laws, is one in which someone can steal and plunder from you, someone can harm you or harm your family, and there's no recourse, there's nothing you can do about it, and there's no protection you have with your own strength and resources. We think this is a terrible place to be, panel. Therefore, we think that in this case specifically, not all cases, but in this case, because the decision is so clear between living in a society, even not a great one, compared to living in a state of nature where it is akin to like genuinely what animals have, where people are constantly attacked and hurt, we think that we can invoke hypothetical consent in this. What do I mean by this? By hypothetical consent, panel, I mean that even in the worst democracies, because it would be so much better to live in a society because of how terrible the state of nature is, we can invoke that any rational individual at the beginning, since they cannot make that choice now, they are born into it, as the speaker identifies, at the point at which we imagine this, any individual in their sane mind would consent to come into the society. Because even if the society isn't perfect, it's better than the state of nature. Okay, but secondly, two other points here. So secondly, note that we also have tacit consent in lots of cases, i.e. you can leave the society you're currently in to go to a different one, just like move abroad, and often people don't, although obviously that doesn't apply in all cases. And then thirdly, note that you can vote, and I will get into this with the principal obligation of democracy in a moment. But also note, panel, that we think we can, even if you don't buy my argument about consent, I think we can justify this on a consequential basis, at the point at which I think you have an obligation to follow rules which promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I think that this is very clear that living in a society does do this, insofar as society is significantly better for people's lives than the state of nature, and therefore should you threaten that or should you undermine it in any way, that is going to be greatly detrimental to the people in that society. Why then do we think you have moral obligations to follow the law? 4 reasons, and integrating democracy and some clash here. Okay, firstly, we think that you consented to this hypothetically, and therefore you should follow it, i.e. because any rational individual would do so, you would also have done so were you given the choice, and therefore you have consented and ought to keep to your word. Secondly, we note that you can justify this on utilitarian grounds. Society is harmed in two specific ways. Firstly, we note that laws are often to protect other people and their property, i.e. a law not to punch me in the face, a law not to murder my child, right? But secondly, we note here that you threaten the stability of society at the point at which you commit actions which undermine the law. That is to say, the benefit of democracy, panel, is that it provides non-violent means to change leaders that don't require revolution. This is the key part of why democracy is so valuable. And we think you threaten and undermine this when you refuse to obey the laws and the things that democracy puts forth. I will take closing before moving on.
You cannot have a moral obligation but still follow the law. We're not going to live in jungle because of the consequentialist arguments that you're giving all this time.
No, the point is, no, they're separate arguments. One is the utilitarian justification for why it's better to live in society. The second is a hypothetical consent model, i.e. before you were into society, any rational individual would consent, and therefore you would have done so. Okay, third reason for this moral obligation then. We think you have a duty to respect the views of your fellow citizens, i.e. even in the cases where you disagree with laws, you have your voice heard insofar as you can vote. Society is a cooperative venture that you've consented into. It's not just for you. Therefore, if you disagree, you still have to follow these laws because that is what society is chosen. When you consent into society and democracy, when you choose to vote, i.e. you choose to potentially affect other people's lives against their consent, you also therefore take on that obligation on yourself against for the decision of others. And note that unlike what the previous speaker says, we think that you can change people's minds, and the point is that you don't have to be able to, because you are able to directly try and influence it with your vote. You have a say, and therefore because everyone else respects your say, you ought to do the same for them. We think it's because you have principle justification in your consent, and we think it's because society is so much better, and you have a moral obligation to promote the greatest happiness for everyone, independent of who they are, that we're very proud to oppose the motion today.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting DPM.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Excellent, thank you. Hello, my name is Yosuke. Gender pronouns he or they, and POI is in the chat box, please. I'll take you before the 6th minute. So yeah, feel free to raise any POI. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What NASA provides you in the preamble speech is structural analysis of how the law is created in a way that is likely to be exclusionary, in a way that is likely to the case where you're not able to have consent and it doesn't exist fundamentally. That is the reason why our arguments are grounded to the extent to which they're immoral. And the opposition argument that, oh, it's more utilitarian to do this is not the same as having a moral obligation to do something inherently. I want to do 3 things in this speech. First is extraneous rebuttals to the arguments that we get from their side of the house. Second, I want to talk about why reciprocity doesn't exist. Lastly, I want to talk about for example, CEO maybe talks about the safety argument, why everyone benefiting from this, why still that is still inherently immoral. Because obviously this is a debate that is revolving around the discussion of morality. First, I want to discuss what they talk about real utilitarianism. I honestly don't understand what the distinction is between the utilitarianism that we talk about, because we talk about how the greatest good for the greatest number comes at the expense of people who are vulnerable and never allowed to do something. Obviously, it comes at, for example, even though you get significant degrees in the plus for the amount of minuses that you get. And we think think that is immoral specifically. But secondarily, what we point out specifically is that the imposition of this and the violent taking away of, like, for example, the violent harm of someone in order to get that good is something that was fundamentally immoral to begin with. And that is what we identify to be something that actively restricts people's freedoms. And insofar as that is something that is like immoral to begin with, means that this utilitarian was immoral, was immoral because you had to do a violent action or violent restriction of person's action in order for this to exist in the first place. The second argument they say is that, well, actually you can change laws anyways. Firstly, this is a only mitigation to the arguments that we provided, but secondarily, does not deal with the nuance that NASA provides you and put forwards in our speech, which is to say that structurally you're out in closed spaces because of the fact that in order for you to change the law means that you either have to become a lawmaker, which requires significant amount of certifications, like in the procedural ways in which you become a lawmaker, actually for you to like get like knowledge and education about the law, for example, to be elected within office, for example. All these things are incredibly difficult to do. But secondarily, the fact that, is not enough for them, like even taking out their best to prove that they can change the law in some instances, but that you can modify it to reflect the individual preferences of every single individual, which we point out is infeasible and therefore is inherently immoral. Because we have to argue from the perspective of an average person who is able to be function and like actually engage with society, and that person specifically is not able to change it. Even if one person is satisfied completely with the law, the other person in the whole spectrum of other people within that society aren't, and that is why it's illegitimate and morally for this to exist, and therefore people don't have an immoral obligation to do this. Next, they talk about the state of nature. 3 responses. Firstly, I honestly don't know, like obviously, like firstly, the state of nature is actually something that's quite good. Like I don't understand why this is a priori bad on their side of the house. Robert Nozick actually said that the state of nature is the ideal society that humans ought to live in the beginning. But firstly, you think that obviously people are likely to, like, even if we're taking state of nature, people are likely to, like, for example, hedge against risks, for example, to establish communities so that they're able to like go against like violence, so that they don't get raided, for example. But secondarily is the fact that they're likely to cooperate within villages, for example, like the places where they live, so that they're able to gain a significant amount of benefits. There's also incentive for you to cooperate in these places anyway, so we don't really see the harm of that. Thirdly is the fact that you're likely to be more free on their side of the house, and we point out this is specifically unique to our side because the state of nature uniquely provides you with autonomy insofar as human like values are subjective, means that this autonomy can be very, very valuable for a specific individual. But we think autonomy is a value that is incredibly important to every single individual. Rather, we point out the state of nature is actually good for these people. But lastly, this is a forced dichotomy, and this is the ultimate response, which is that even if the state of nature is immoral, multiple systems can be immoral. Like this, both obviously the society that we live in can be immoral, so can the state of nature. Just because one thing is better does not mean there's a moral obligation to follow it, and therefore they can't win on this fundamentally, even if they decide to prove it. Next, they talk about democracy, and I don't understand why this is likely to be the case. 2 responses again. Firstly, like democracy is not inherent to law in the first place. Lots of authoritarian regimes are quite immoral and use the law in really bad ways. Look at i.e. like countries that are like invading and like causing war in specific areas, for example. But secondarily, even if this was true, the fact that democracy doesn't account for everyone is something that is inherent within the system insofar as it's representative of the majority. And so obviously the minorities or people, like even like majorities aren't like don't have their preferences 100% reflected within the law, and therefore this is also morally illegitimate. Before I move on, are there any POIs? All right, seeing as there are none, I want to talk about reciprocity. I want to deal with this through 2 layers. Firstly, on pragmatics. We think that reciprocity is unlikely to happen for a variety of reasons. Firstly, is the fact that it's likely to be exclusionary for the reasons that NASA tells you, which is that obviously the lawmakers who are likely to like make these laws are often come from privileged backgrounds, and they have to have certain prerequisites. For example, knowledge about the law, to deal with civil discourse, to know about like the certifications, for example. And this happens within closed spaces, which means that people are likely to be excluded from the creation of law systems to begin with, and therefore there's no reciprocity. But secondarily, there's also racism against these people, or in like from traditions and conservative people, and therefore people are unlikely to be reflected within the context of how law operates within the current social framework. Secondarily, though, it's likely to be not representative at all, right? First is the fact that because in order for you to be represented means that you have to be represented within politics, and politics can only represent a limited amount of time insofar as quite majoritarian to begin with. But secondarily is the fact that obviously the manifestation of it is actually something that is present within courts, and like courts, which are oftentimes, for example, racist, for example, or not representative of the mass majority population. So how law is executed within court is also something that's likely to be like pragmatically wrong to begin with, and therefore this is unjust, and therefore this reciprocity doesn't exist as well. But secondarily, also on the principle, I want to talk about three structural layers to this. Firstly, obviously you didn't contact and make the contract yourself. That is that you were never a moral agent within the creation of this contract, and therefore there's also no obligation for you to have reciprocity. Secondarily, there's no consent involved insofar as you never agreed within that policy as well, because you didn't sign a paper or anything. You didn't sign a paper to agree with the laws, for example, and therefore there was nothing of consent to exist within this as well. But thirdly, is the fact that these resources are forcibly taken from you through violent measures by the state is also a reason why this reciprocity isn't reciprocity, or rather just violence, and therefore you have no inherent moral obligation to follow this. Lastly, I want to talk about the safety net and why, even if everyone benefits, this is still bad. Firstly, I want to talk about the pragmatic actual the safety net, welfare schemes, for example. Firstly, it's likely to be majoritarian, which means that it's only likely to help the majority who have access to the safety net, for example, at the expense of the most vulnerable minorities within society. That's how it actually manifests within society. But secondarily, we think it's not certain, it's really, really uncertain insofar as it's also obstructed by conditions. So what I mean by this is that people might die, for example, people might become sick, people might move to different places, people might become disenfranchised. All these are conditions which mean that people perhaps are not able to get the benefits of it, right? Because people obviously die in that instance. And therefore this imposition of a moral obligation is something that's immoral because they don't receive it at the end of the day. But thirdly is the fact that these are decided arbitrarily by the state, right? You have who decides who pays more taxes for some benefits to manifest, or which freedoms to restrict to get more other freedoms, for example. All these are decided more arbitrarily by the state, and therefore there's the oral basis for this to be immoral. For all those reasons, opening government wins.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the front half of this debate.
One sec, let me just get set up. One sec. Okay, everyone ready? I will start in. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. 4 main things I'm going to talk about. One, I'm going to talk about consent, then autonomy and choice. And thirdly, reciprocity, and fourthly, about utility. All right, so first about this whole sort of push on consent, which is the first basis of the OG argument. Basically, David already explains to you why you have consented to this in the first place. But I think at the end of the day, I don't really think you consenting to living in a society or that your consent was stripped away really matters at all, because the human condition is contingent on consent being taken away anyways. Such as when you were born, you did not choose to be born in the first place. You did not choose who your parents are. You do not choose who you live. This is contingent to the human condition to be. This is contingent on the humans everywhere have the consent taken away anyway. I'm not. Sorry, government has the burden of proving why this is so different, that this matters, why we take their consent away in this specific instant. I think David already explains why society is necessary in the first place, why your consent being taken away to live in a society matters so much. I think the only sort of response we sort of get from government is that oh, it's not really a dichotomy between living in the state of nature where everything is wild and living in the state of society. I think it is true that if you get rid of all laws, that everything will just fall apart, because true following laws is what characterizes society in the first place, right? I think we get no counter characterization, so we just have to go with David, and I think he already gives good reasons at that. All right, now into the second thing, the autonomy and choice. I think this is where the majority of the government case lies, and sort of saying that your autonomy has been taken away, and so in the first place, you don't have your ability to change. I think one, note that others are, sorry, note that basically they're saying that others are asserting their values onto yours. I think in terms of the principle of autonomy in this regard is the law is basically saying what everyone must follow, and you do have some say. I'll get into some sort of explanation on this later, but I think when you get rid of the law and when you're going against this, you're going against, sorry, when you're breaking the law, you are going against the principle of autonomy insofar that you're taking away the autonomy of others. I'm unclear why we ought to weigh sort of the moral obligation of the individual more than sort sort of your moral obligation to others due to reciprocity, which I'll come back later in my speech. I think like the reason why it's necessary for this to be codified is because is so that everyone can agree upon it and everyone actively knows this rather than it being left to everyone's own individual moral judgments. I think it's much easier for everyone to follow the law, thereby meaning that it's far less likely that others sort of assert autonomy, others strip autonomy of others when they do an action that sort of breaks the law. For example, when I have the law and I know that it's not okay to steal a car, right? I know that I'm going to face repercussions for this. Is necessary for the law to be known by everyone. And that is just a fundamental characterization of the said society we live in. I think you have like, and so if said law, if you were to break it, you are essentially breaking the trust and autonomy of those around you. They did not choose for you to necessarily, they did not choose for you to steal their stuff. They did not choose for you to harm them in this certain way, even if it doesn't impact individuals directly. I think they also did not choose for you to break this law. They agreed upon by living in this society in whatever way and analysis that we've given, that you must follow this anyway. I think it is also just, I think it's, David already touched on this, but it's also just good that you cannot assert laws over others, that there isn't just a single person who necessarily chooses laws as you and as an individual. And then finally, I think like you also have like some ability to change yourself. Basically, OG just sort of makes these assumptions that, it's very unlikely that you can change laws. Your vote has little matter, and laws are just decided by past generations anyway. I think like this one note that this is already collectively agreed upon for reasons that is just simplistic and everyone can follow, and that is the only way that is organized in a sufficient way to actively achieve the principles that we desire on our side of the house. All right, and I think like regardless of whether it was like decided by like the masses that you didn't agree to, this is just going to be in like the most general case, probably laws that you're going to agree with. But even in laws that you don't agree with, once again, we don't have the justification why you necessarily deserve more than others. And that's why I want to get into sort of the third theme of this, that being reciprocity. I think like if you do something for others, right? So you are basically doing something for others when you are following the law, and they are doing something for you when they follow the law, right? You are both making sacrifices for each other, and you're basically doing something for, you are basically benefiting each other. And the reason why you have a moral obligation of reciprocity, because if you break the law, two things. One, laws that are protecting others, right, is detrimental, that you're harming those who actively support you. They support you because they follow the law that you ought to follow as well. They follow this law and making sacrifices, and now you are actively harming them. You are breaking this moral obligation of reciprocity that you have to this individual, right? If I steal this car, this person didn't steal my car. I shouldn't steal their car as well. All right. And then the second reason is that like, even if this does not directly impact people, even if this is a law that doesn't directly impact individuals, if you break it, you are basically having an unfair advantage over others in society. It's unclear why we ought to weigh an individual's sort of utility over that of others, right? It's not about autonomy because everyone has autonomy stripped anyway. And I think that is, you're just giving yourself an unfair advantage, which is inequitable to all. And I think that this would exist regardless of whether we're in a democratic state or an autocratic state, right? Even if you don't have any say in how the laws are made, you are still giving yourself an unfair advantage by breaking the law. I'll take one from closing. Closing, opening.
Yeah, so assumed consent is just coercion, and you have to live in a state, so that because states are everywhere. Obviously, this means that you don't have explicit agreement to the laws in the first place, and therefore there is absolutely no consent.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, this is exactly what I'm saying. Like, even if you live in an autocratic state where you have like very little say, you will still have a moral duty to those around you, and so to the masses around you, right? You may not have a moral duty to whoever like the autocrat is, but you have a duty to those around you because they are helping you by following the law in the same way that you have, right? It's unfair that you have an unfair advantage. And also a second line of clash, I already dealt with this whole thing about consent. All right, finally on this idea about, finally on like utility and why we ought to just take it over both the front and the back half. I think like in terms of utility, we provide like the rule utilitarianism grounds insofar that when everyone follows a collectively agreed upon laws is going to be beneficial to people everywhere, right? I think it's going to be beneficial in the majority of cases. It's unclear why sort of like on utilitarian grounds, why breaking autonomy is going to be bad for the most amount of people. And it's for the reason that we prove on like this consequential ground and principled ground that we win this debate. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting member of government to start the back half.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are both audible and visible.
Cool. Let me set up my timer and then I'll begin. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition is right in this debate. Most, like everyone doesn't consent to being born, and thus consent can't be the right metric. I'll analyze this more later because everyone is going through the same trauma, and that cannot be the rule set to how we dictate what is morally correct or incorrect. But the problem with opening opposition is they never tell me why their utilitarian metric, the exact one they try to implement in this metric, number one, is the correct utilitarian metric, but two, maximizes the utility in the form that it does. Closing government is going to solve both these halves, creating a new rule, like deontological rule set in order to help like you understand why it's morally incorrect to there's no moral obligation to always follow the law. Few ideas here. One, I'm going to give a quick intuition pump, right? Imagine a person is drowning in a lake. You can swim, you can probably save that person. One, then look at OG's analysis and how this actually engages with this particular analogy, right? One, you did not consent into being born, which means you also on both sides of the house. Two, you never consented to the law, which also means you never consented to this person drowning. But three, you also never made the decision for this person to drown, which is the same as you never made the decision in the law. But four, you didn't buy into the consequences of this person drowning, which doesn't make sense in this debate because this debate is following the law, not the punitive measurements that come afterwards. So that's automatically out of the debate. But my point is, you never consider to being born or this person drowning. Regardless of all of that, you have a moral obligation to save that particular person. And we all need to agree this is true, because if that is not true, there is no moral obligation in the world because you were born without consent, therefore no moral obligations exist. If that is OG's argument, they fail to run it because they do not satisfy their own burden of proving there is no moral obligation. But if there is true that some moral obligation exists, it's probably true you need to save this drowning person because that is what we consider as morally right. If that is true, all of the analysis that they gave to you in consent applies directly to this analogy, but it fails to convert because here you see a moral obligation. Opening opposition points this out very well as well, right? The point in which everyone is born without consent, which means you that person did not consent into drowning and you did not consent to saving that person. You can't go ahead and use this as the correct rule set to measure obligations in terms of like morality. What do we use then? I think opening opposition is right that a deontological perspective is correct, where you have a set of rules that define how you need to behave in front of other people and how you need to go ahead and engage with society as a whole. The thing problematic about the case is it never explained, one, why this is the law, but number two, why you need to follow the law, and that is the only rule set that is correct in this debate, right? Because understand, even though the value of consent evaporates, the point at which nobody consent, we still need to go ahead and have some moral obligation towards other. What does this moral obligation look like, and why does it not go ahead, like follow the law? Two ideas here. Number one, the point at which you do not really choose the law, and the law is obviously in contradiction to yourself. There is, you have to go ahead and maximize your own autonomy, because the law fundamentally exists in an era, in a place where you go ahead and it contradicts within yourself. This is because the law is number one, ever changing, but number two, you just don't always know what the law is. Notice this is different from OG, right? Because I'm not talking about simply not following the law is the right thing to do. I'm saying the need then in this debate is to define a different rule set and one that you need to follow, to the extent that this A can be possibly the utilitarian metric. We think it is impossible this is the correct law set for multiple reasons. One, we don't think you can go ahead and justify it as an individual to measure other people's utility. What this particularly looks like is you as a one person have no moral right or like any moral responsibility to go ahead and measure what the utility of other people can be, which means you have no moral right to go ahead and then measure how your particular actions are going to go ahead and act against another person. don't let opposition strawman this by saying, oh, you still can't kill people, because this debate is not about killing people. It's just about whether you should be forced to view the perspective of law through a utilitarian perspective. We'd like to posit at CG that this is untrue, because you can never as an individual measure what is the true utility of an individual, which means even if you go ahead and act in accordance to the law, it might harm the utility of the person for reasons I've already given you as to why the law itself exists in a contradiction to this. So we cannot use the utilitarian perspective, because there also utilitarian perspective never maximizes utility. But second reason, you don't know if these people actually are fundamentally existing. And this is going to sound weird, bear with me for a second. The point at which you have no epistemic access towards proving that other people will exist or not, or what their autonomy looks like, or whether, number one, whether their autonomy exists, but number two, I've already proved to you what their autonomy looks like and what necessarily maximizes their utility. And this is a question about you will never be able to prove. I'm unsure as an individual why it is then in your sincerest moral obligation to go ahead and then try to maximize this utility that A might not exist, but B you do not understand. The only utility you can possibly prove that exists, and prove that also is what is correct for that autonomy is your own, which means you have an inherent obligation, if you want to maximize utility of this debate, to go ahead and maximize the only one you can understand, which is your own utility. The point at which the law goes ahead and contradicts your own utility, there is no inherent reason that you always need to follow every single law all the time. Because now, if it is true that you need to maximize the utility and you need to create a rule set to maximize your own utility, you cannot fundamentally understand anyone else's utility, because you never have access to those things, which means to maximize utility in this debate, the only way you can do it is follow your own. I take the PI from opening up.
Yeah, so just because I don't understand what other people's experiences are, why should I just go ahead and say stealing their cars if I find it fun? I think this is like a straw man to say that that's the only thing I ought to be morally obligated to.
Again, here's the straw man, right? To the extent that you as an individual cannot measure the utility, you do not know whether this is right or wrong, because you do not have, you as a single person cannot decide whatever person's utility is. Society has assigned a moral good and moral bad on an average case. That does not mean you fundamentally are responsible for deciding anyone's utility in this debate. Number one, you can't just hold societal expectations to be what is morally good. But number two, the point at which you don't know if they have utility because you cannot prove their existence or their autonomy means that, again, you don't know whether you're doing the morally correct thing. The morally correct thing is the one that you are able to understand and are able to then go ahead and create an actionable effort towards. That is your own autonomy, because that is the only thing that's real to you. To that extent, it's very important you go ahead and follow your own you go ahead and follow your own utility, right? But also understand the point at which you don't then follow, you then follow the law, you're committing a moral harm against yourself constantly, because this is probably going to go against your utility, because it's impossible that the law always goes ahead and coincides with the utility, which means it's in your own interest to go ahead and maximize your own utility, which is opening opposition's entire idea. But you do that better on our side of the house, the point at which you don't follow the law. OO's consequentialist principles assume you can measure everyone's utility and you have the correct understanding of this utility, something you do not have the responsibility or the ability to do. So you maximize your own utility. So proud to propose.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting member of opposition.
All right, PYs in the chat, please. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to start by positioning my team in the round because this has been a really messy debate. Here's why we will do better than opening government. Opening government, as I pointed in a POI, sets a really high bar for us and then doesn't meet it. They literally try to claim that there is no such thing as consent and that you can never consent. Panel, if you had a country made up of 10 people, those 10 people could meet and come up with laws by consensus. This has literally happened with indigenous peoples in North America. They would have small tribal communities that would come up with laws by consensus. By definition, you therefore can consent to laws sometimes. Therefore, their burden, which is to prove there is never an obligation, there is no inherent obligation, does not exist so long as you may live in a society whereby laws are determined by consent. So OG is immediately out because their entire case is contingent on proving that sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does, when their burden is to literally prove there is no whatsoever inherent burden. OO is a little bit weird in that they first of all use Hobbesian logic. And again, panel, I just want to note, as soon as they said the word that there's hypothetical consent, it's not consent. The average average person consented to get the COVID-19 vaccine doesn't mean we could forcibly vaccinate people that don't want it just because we said, well, the average person would consent to it. So there is also out of the route, also like rule utilitarianism is not helpful unless you have the rules in front of you. Like literally, if you want to do the organ donation model, like you could sacrifice 49% of people just to help the 51%. So I think compared to OO, we are not defending rule utilitarianism. I escaped therefore significant amounts of CG clash. Let's move on to CG. How do we compare? CG literally just runs egoism, the assumption that no one else exists, therefore I can do whatever the fuck I want. This is absolutely nuts. Panel, I think what is far more likely is epistemic humility, that because you do not know that other people do or do not exist, you must therefore assume that they do and act in accordance so that you do not infringe on their sovereignty, infringe on their utility, infringe on their consent, whatever you want to use, on the off chance that you are about to hurt a real individual. The reason this is selfishly motivated is because you want other people to assume that you also exist. Therefore, if you want to engage in a reciprocal society whereby people generally operate on the same rules, you have to treat people like they exist in order for them to treat you as existing. I think it's absolutely crazy that they are literally running the case that you can't assume other people exist, therefore you can do whatever you want. Like, I can't assume that I'm going to get caught if I rob a bank, therefore I should just rob a bank. Actually wild. I can't believe they ran that, but it doesn't make any sense given that it isn't principally sound and that you probably shouldn't just do whatever you want. You should probably be respectful of other people's sovereignty, therefore not infringe on it just in the off chance they do actually exist. All right, how do we position ourselves in the round finally with our extension? I'm going to note here, panel, that the important thing that was missing out of OO when they focused too much on community, on like the utility argument, and they tried to extend in their back half on something different, is that they missed the social construction of the self. Here's what the important thing, panel, is. You are never separate from the society in which you exist. What does this mean? Everything about yourself, your sense of identity, your goals, your preferences, your fears, your hopes, everything about you is socially constructed. How tall you are, determined by how much food you had access to as a child, or if you were malnourished. Your goals are determined by what your society taught you was valuable. That's why you could have like two ancient Greek cities, Athens, which valued like peace and democracy in the arts, and Sparta that literally valued killing other people. They were right next to each other, genetically basically the same group of people, but society constructed different norms and values. Therefore, the people in those societies were massively different. The same is true today. Each and every one of us likely believes the things we believe, want the things we want, and have the sense of self we have, largely because of the society in which we grew up. And this is true as soon as you step into a new society. This takes care of OG, which is like the front half deadlock over like, can you just go to a different society? Given that the human being is changing, like every experience changes who you are because you now have new memories, new goals, new priorities and circumstances. The second you step into that new society, you are now being shaped by that society. Therefore, you will be shaped by it and cannot separate yourself from it. What does this mean? That the person is inseparable from society. Panel, laws in a principled sense, sidestepping the whole OO thing where like they just assume democracies exist. Like their case doesn't make any sense, especially the first speaker, outside of democracies where there is no consent and no voting. Panel, generally a rule by which everyone follows, even if you don't like it. Like people that live in despotic regimes still choose to follow the laws, not because of consent, but because they decide their best option between trying to revolt or just following the laws. They pick and choose for themselves what the best option is. So that means, panel, there is broad social buy-in, not necessarily consent, but buy-in, which is just an agreement to follow those rules. The important thing here is, panel, when you attempt to disallow, like to separate yourself from society, assume that I do not have to follow the rules of society, you do a couple of things. Number one, you inherently sever your relationship with society. You cannot operate on a different set of rules from everyone else. It's like speaking a different language to people you're trying to communicate. That's because society is inherently dependent on interactions between individuals that operate on a system of trust. If I'm afraid of someone, like I genuinely walk up to someone and I don't know if they're going to kill me, I'm probably going to stay far away from them. So the ability to literally interact with one another is inherent on the assumption that you are operating on similar principles, similar rules, similar goals and values. So therefore, when you refuse to follow laws, you cut yourself off from society. Because your like sense of self is socially constructed, your sense of what is good and valuable is also socially constructed. Because a society that teaches its own people that being independent, like fuck society, wouldn't exist as a society. It would literally break down. Therefore, all of us to some degree have socially oriented goals. By cutting yourself off from society, you are therefore preventing yourself from achieving any form of actualization. I think this beats CG because it's not just egoism, it's that you probably have an obligation to yourself. So long as you are a self-respecting, autonomous human being, you do not want to limit yourself from achieving your own preferences. Therefore, so long as you value yourself, you have an obligation to yourself to follow laws. I'll take OG.
Even if you're self-reflective of what the society is constructed on, the laws aren't self-reflective of what you believe in, and therefore this reciprocal obligation of the law doesn't exist. But even if that isn't true, these people never consented into being born, even if there's a consensus on what the law is.
So you didn't consent to be born. Society didn't consent for you to be born either. Like, they're stuck with you just as much as you're stuck with them. But panel, I want to know one final thing. An inherent obligation is not the same as an overriding obligation. I have an inherent right to free speech. I can argue that. That doesn't mean I can say hate speech, because that interferes with other people's right to life if I'm like calling to lynch other people. So when rights are in conflict, we prioritize one or the other. That doesn't mean the rights cease to exist. It's just that we choose to prioritize them in different ways. So when we say there's an inherent right to follow the law, the obligation to follow the law, that means it always exists, but it doesn't always override. That's how we sidestep a lot of Gov's material about like unfair laws, because in the case where you literally have laws that violate your ability to exist as a human, like your right to life, you have the obligation to follow the laws. You also have an obligation to yourself to continue to exist. So we don't have to all like follow literally every single law all the time. It's just we have to prove that that obligation in a vacuum, absence of any specifics, does exist. And because you have an obligation to yourself and the self is socially constructed, you cannot cut yourself off from society by ignoring laws. That is why you have the obligation to follow them. So proud to stand on CO.
Thanks for that speech. Inviting Government Whip to conclude the case on CG and Gov bench as a whole.
Hey, yeah, just give me some moments. I need to organize my notes. Okay, just apologies for a second. I'll just quickly visit the washroom and be back.
Sure.
Okay, I'm back. I hope I'm clearly audible.
Yes, you are.
Preferred pronounce he, they. I won't really be checking the chat for POIs. I'll take preferably from the opening. Yep. Once again, can someone confirm if I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Starting my speech then in 3, 2, 1. A clear issue with most philosophy debates is that it ends up being a jargon war between teams, with most arguments not necessarily making coherent sense. What I'll do over here then is ground this debate, give examples and frameworks in terms of how all the analysis made by teams operate in the real world, and then show why our paradigm is the best paradigm for individuals to cooperate. Firstly then, on a short note on consent. Note over here, my member clearly points out that, look, most people, everyone doesn't consent to being born. The idea of lottery of birth applies symmetrically across all people. Both opposition teams are right to point that the society simply doesn't consent to your existence. There's probably a mutual that's probably a mutual deadlock that you enter into. At that point of time, wherever you do understand that there exists some moral obligation onto some individuals in some circumstances, then that probably means that consent is not really the overriding factor in this. But then, coming on to our case and why exactly CO's system doesn't exactly work. Note over here that all the analysis made by CO is basically contingent on you are a part of a collective. There's probably benefits for you, and there's probably utility gain at the point of time you do follow the norms and the traditions of the collective, wherein it allows all individuals to engage in some form of exchange that mutually benefit, that mutually maximizes each other's utility. The issue over here is that this falls apart when we analyze to you that look, you are unable to measure any other person's thoughts, actions, agency, but also their utility and what is the best way to maximize the utility. But secondly, just grounding it in more normal terms, right? First, understand that the fundamental question then boils down to is, do you know any action that you're going to commit is utile or not? Over here, inherently when the motion says, let's talk about inherent moral obligation. Note over here, that means that you think that this moral obligation is something that's intrinsic to you, that's something that's permanent, something that you should follow at every instance of time. While yes, this may not be overriding as CEO points out, and that may not necessarily be the only reason that you act on or drives all your action. What it does fundamentally mean is at the point of time you break this inherent moral obligation, that means that you are generally conceived to be committing a moral harm. Note over here, this framing is very important because then the pathway to win this debate becomes very clear, which means that at the point of time, we are able to show to you that at the instance you do not necessarily follow the law, you are still you break the law or you don't follow the law, and it is vague or unclear or it's probably false that you have committed a moral harm. That probably then means that you do not have an inherent moral obligation to follow the law. The general idea by both gov teams is that law is a great approximation or a very wonderful approximation to the moral system of an individual or to the moral values of individual. We clearly contest that. Note over here a few pieces of framing then. Firstly, just let's ground this, right? You are a daily wage worker. You're barely making any means. You have family to cater to. Maybe your friends, maybe your, let's say your wife, your family, etc. starving. You have old parents that you need to take care of. At that point of time, note over here, the collective has already failed you in terms of them not being able to provide you meaningful access to quality of life. But second, that you are able to perceive that the individuals that do care, that the individuals that you attach some amount of value to are clearly undergoing suffering. Your own self is undergoing suffering. At that point of time, you probably see that it is important for you to collect resources to ensure that the suffering does get over. At that point of time, if you commit a theft, it then is unclear if, let's say, you have committed a moral harm because you have broken the law, or you have done a moral good because you have ended the suffering of those individuals whom you can clearly see. This idea can be propagated, let's say, across multiple laws, right? Note over here, the idea isn't that law is inherently harmful or law in every circumstance is bad. It's just that while yes, there may be some approximation of the law to moral values, this approximation is not perfect. There are many flaws existing in this. There are many breakpoints existing when individuals need to form their own bureaucratic system, need to base their own experiences and their own perception and decide where exactly are maximizing utility. Over here, then, firstly, in comparison to our opening opposition. Look, the primary case of opening opposition is that, look, only at the point of time you are, let's say, engaging with the law, you're following the law to its T, are you engaging in real utilitarism and you're maximizing the utility for every individual. It's weird to give a counterfactual as anarchy or the natural state because we're unclear why that's so, especially since if we give us utilitarian arguments as to why there's possibly some use of engaging the collective. Note over here, we do bite the bullet. We do agree that there is some utility in engaging with the collective. We don't think this is absolute. We don't think this is inherent. We think that there are multiple breakpoints to the same. Over here, then, crucially, where exactly do we take it over our opening document? We are the only side that talks to you about the individual and how the individual's perception shapes the world. It's not about whether you consent into the law or not. It's not about whether you're able to mold the laws or not. It's just that laws are inflexible, dead entities, while the existence is a moving, vivid realm with multiple possibilities that laws simply cannot account for. Which then means, at the point of time, you, by your own self-perception, are able to see that following the law commits moral harm ontowards you. That simply means that your moral obligation then no longer applies. In that case, moral obligation simply cannot be inherent. Before I move on, a PR from O.
When you save the drowning person, do they consent to be saved, or do you infer a hypothetical consent that you and a rational person would give and therefore violate their consent justifiably?
Okay, I think it's pretty simple over here. If, let's say, a drowning person, okay, note over here, you being able to see a drowning person attempts, which means that they're able to stay afloat, they're trying to stay afloat, they're probably screaming for him. At that point of time, you by their own actions are able to see that they are crying for him, which is why you save them. Similarly, for example, if someone, Similarly, under that circumstance, note over here, if let's say a soldier goes to a battlefield, they are consenting that their lives may be lost. You saving them at that point of time under your circumstance of hypothetical. And note over here, let's do this example, right? When a soldier goes to a battlefield, there's a high chance that their life may be lost. Under O's paradigm of hypothetical consent, you're inherently assuming that, oh look, people losing their lives is bad, which is why I should prevent the soldier from going to the border. Under our circumstance, okay, which simply does not work. Clearly, then, what you should take back in this debate. Most deontological systems are imperfect. The only thing that you can base your worldview on is your own perception and is, let's say, the observational perception that you do. Whilst let's say the general trends of society and general observation in my society may be useful and maybe an approximation to the truth, it is not the absolute truth. There are many imperfections existing in society, which then means that there are flaws existing in terms of how society views moral good and moral bad. At that point of time, it's best for individuals to base moral obligations towards their own perception, and hence only on our side are you able to maximize the utility of individuals. Which is why very, very proud to propose.
Great, thanks for that speech. Inviting opposition whip to conclude the case on CO, on our bench, and the debate as a whole.
Sorry, I turned on video and said something. I'm assuming I can be heard.
Yep.
Okay. Your eyes in chat, please. I'll probably take one from opening at 5:30. I'll count you down before I start my speech. Just give me a couple of seconds. Okay, starting 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, we're just going to go team by team and explain to you why on a specific comparative we take it over every single team in the round. Starting with opening government, right? I think it's fairly clear they're already out of this debate for a very simple reason, that they kind of push a burden on like other teams that they themselves do not meet, right? Note the consent situations they bring to you on the idea that people do not have consent to escape the situations they're born in. Additionally, the fact that people do not have the power to change the situations or the laws they live under. And the first one, of course, being people do not consent to be born, right? Note the idea of people not being able to consent to escape it, insofar as there exist situations in which people can escape like the situations that they're born into, the universality of their principle does not apply. No, there's the existence of sovereigns, people who choose to live outside the rules of law within nation states, like being able to decide that they just don't want to follow the law and for the most part don't interact with the vast majority of ordered society and live fairly okay. And also exist like outlaws. Yes, they're like hunted down by the law and there are consequences for their actions. That does not necessarily mean that they do not have the option to be outlaws. Additionally, note, when they say like people don't have the power to change it, they themselves kind of like contradict themselves when they say that you need to be a lawyer or a politician or like someone who is educated to be able to change the law. That naturally means that there is a possibility for individuals to have some ability to change the law. People can do it. If you're making an assumption about whether people will or will not be able to do it, it's fairly simple to say it's a 50-50 in terms of can people do it versus can people do it. The burden on their side was to prove then it is 100% chance that people are completely unable to do it. Hence, it then justifies a moral the removal of a moral obligation to follow something that you have absolutely no power to. But additionally, the idea that people are still able to change the minds of others. I think in a general, in a nutshell, right? Their case is situational. It's situational to individuals who are not necessarily in a position to change the law or to consent to be able to live outside of it, which for the vast majority of instances is not true, since most individuals have the ability to literally pick up and be outlaws if they so choose, if they're not afraid of the consequences, right? So in that instance, there's nothing inherited. There's nothing inherent to the existence of a moral obligation or to law itself when it comes to the principle of consent that they want to bring forward. Additionally, it is not universal. Hence, consent is not the metric by which this debate is going to be judged, largely because you cannot say that there's no moral obligation just because there is absolutely no consent, because that is just, again, categorically false. Secondly, on the clash about like valuing autonomy, note, absolute autonomy is a myth, right? At the end of the day, we still have to obey the laws of nature. We can't like bend physics to our own will. So note, there is a natural limit to the amount of autonomy individuals have. There's no such thing as absolute autonomy. In the absence of an absolute autonomy, they would then have had to prove that slightly more autonomy is still of value, right? I'm going to just give you one reason because they just assert it's still okay. One reason why it's not. Note, then they buy into OO's utility metric. They buy into the idea that slightly more autonomy is better because it gives you slightly more some form of utility, which means on that metric, then they're already out of the debate. But additionally, the idea that like slightly more autonomy doesn't necessarily always like lead to a tangible benefit or even some form of principled benefit when you know that autonomy in and of itself in an absolute value is unattainable, then why is it something that we should value or is good? Secondly, note that the slightly more autonomy at the same time is not valuable or as valuable as your moral obligation to the law, or more importantly, to your own sustenance, B, as Lachlan tells you, like society as a whole that creates you. And in those instances, the law is what upholds the society that creates you and yourself, and you have a moral obligation to yourself. So in that instance, autonomy does not then, or slightly more autonomy does not outweigh the moral obligation you have to your own sustenance and to the society that creates you. Cool. Moving to opening opposition and why we take it up against him. I think the biggest problem with them is they just create this rule utilitarianism system, right? Which is that you have a duty to those around you, but they fail on the justification for it. We better explain why you have a duty to those around you. But get this, right? Firstly, they give you rule utilitarianism without telling you what the rules of this fucking system are. Secondly, they're limited, like their case only is that their case is limited to situations in which people have the agency or the ability to change the laws. Our case, and Lachlan specifically justifies this for you, is still valid under a fucking dictatorship, right? Which means we automatically have a better justification when we have a more universal justification for moral obligation. Lastly, the concept of hypothetical consent is Lachlan already addressed that. Like hypothetical consent in and of itself is not consent. Note the vast majority of their utility metric assumes that hypothetical consent exists so they can circumnavigate the problem of consent. I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, notice that the burden on this motion is asymmetric. On opposition, op teams have to prove that the existence of the moral obligation exists, which means you have to always follow the law. Government just says that you're justified to act in it because the state imposes, you're uncertain to receive benefits, there's no consent, violence is imposed upon you, and it's situational, to which you concede. So you prove our point that is actually the burden to prove.
I already proved to you that like your points about like you not being able to move out of the situations you're born into, or like the fact that you have no power over the laws you change, is categorically false, because theoretically that is true, right? In like a philosophical world, it is true. If you have 10 people in a country, you can come together and form a consensus and necessarily make the law. You have more people, sure, you have a lesser power and a great less degree of power in your ability to change the law, but no, like some power is still important. And secondly, we also explain to you, like you have an obligation to yourself, which is why you have an obligation to the law. We don't necessarily we actually do meet our burden of justifying that in every instance of a human being, you are a product of the society that builds you. So necessarily you have an obligation to that society and hence to yourself as a proxy of that society to basically have follow the law. And if you do not have that moral obligation and do not follow the law, you're naturally self-sabotaging at that instance. Coming to closing government, right? I think their case just implicitly, the bunch of their case was just clashing with OO. We sidestep this by largely saying that, yeah, you have an obligation to yourself, not necessarily society as a whole. The only obligation you have to society as a whole is in the fact that society created you. We don't need to be able to measure this, right? Like just to have an obligation to follow the law, it doesn't mean you need to be able to measure the level or the degree of impact society has on you. We can simply say society has made the vast majority of who you are, and your goals, aspirations, and your own well-being is then inherently tied to society to some degree, doesn't matter what degree. And insofar as the laws are then imposed by this society and you have to necessarily live in the society that follows these laws, you have a moral obligation to follow them, right? And lastly, coming to their case, right, which is you just have only thing is maximize your own utility because you don't know about anything else. Again, as Lachlan pointed out, this is largely egoism. We don't get too much response, and it's a 50-50. They don't explain why that is the best way out. Specifically, if there is a 50-50 chance of another way out in which you don't have to necessarily maximize only your own utility, you can assume that everyone else exists. You can assume that you should also do things that don't hurt other people. Quick final summary on why we win this debate. Lachlan tells you, right, the idea is that when you are socially constructed, when your identity cannot be detached from that of the society that you live in, you have a moral obligation to protect your own identity, which is then inherently tied to your well-being, your goals, your dreams, and everything about you that exists. In that instance, then you have a moral obligation to yourself, and that moral obligation manifests into a moral obligation to protect the law or follow the law. We're so proud to Oppose.
Thanks for that speech and all of the speakers for what was a wonderful debate.